Welcome everybody to the second episode of season 2 of the Blue Dragon podcast, and I just interviewed Graham Gold, who is a cybersecurity architect and who co-authored the book on the SC100 exam by Microsoft. I really enjoyed this episode because we talked about cybersecurity in the cloud. Why is it different from on-premise? What to look out for? And I was particularly interested in his answer on how to spend your security budget in the cloud. Enjoy this episode. Have a great time. So welcome everybody to the third episode of the Blue Dragon podcast season 2. And today I have a special guest. Today I have the co-author of the Microsoft Cybersecurity Architect Exam, the SC100, Graham Gold. He co-authored this nice book. Graham, welcome on the show.
Thank you, Jethro. Thanks for having me along.
My pleasure. And for us that don't know you yet, can you take a minute and just explain your background and how you ended up co-authoring this great book?
Yeah, cool. It's quite a varied story, but so I've been in financial services IT for about 27 and a half years. So started with kind of operations, server operations, mainframe operations, moving into more mainframe technical, and then increasingly designing solutions, not quite architect, but effectively solution architecture within the technical team. And then 2019, 2020, there was an opportunity through changes in my employer to actually exit. And at that point, I thought, well, mainframe is kind of, it's getting to that place where there are good jobs in it. There are less and less of them. Cloud or security is probably where I should go next and where my head is. And for the last 4 or 5 years now, moved into engineering, both on-prem and cloud solutions from a security engineering perspective. And then my current role is a senior cloud security engineer with an insurance company. So that's kind of my potted history. There's a lot that doesn't say, but...
That's fine. And how did you end up co-authoring this book by Pact?
It's one of those kind of accidental, organic things, really. So I got one of those introductions messages on LinkedIn from one of the project managers at Pact, and we're interested in authors for this book. And initially, working in security, is this genuine? And I was already connected with Dwayne, the first edition author, on LinkedIn. So I pinged them to say, do you think this is genuine? Do you know these guys? Also, Rue Campbell, I've bought one of his books with Pact. So very quickly established, okay, this is actually genuine. And really set the scene that, Dwayne had done edition 1. Obviously, the exam curriculum had changed quite a bit. The book needed to be refreshed. And Dwayne, as I think he mentioned in episode 10 of the first series, he had a lot going on. He didn't have the bandwidth to go and do edition 2. And that's really how it was. It was, I did actually ask the project manager, why did you get in touch? Did somebody send you my way? And it was literally just looking for people who kind of work in that kind of cloud security space, who've passed the exam and who, I guess, maybe blog and share information online, who might be a good fit. And that's really what, a happy accident, shall we say.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, and like you mentioned, we had Dwayne on in the final episode of the previous season. Really nice. By the way, I had both books, the first edition and the second edition, and I really like the second edition. It's up to date. Pact also changed the format. It's also with the mock exam and some questions to prepare. So it's a really nice package for those who are interested to pick up the book. We'll also put the link in the description so people can order the book. But Graham, as our audience is mainly IT and business leaders, can you explain a bit like the 3 levels in Microsoft certifications, where the top one is the architect, which is this one? Like, what are the 3 levels, and what is the meaning of those?
So you kind of start with fundamentals type exams, which they don't expire, shall we say. You don't have to resit them every year. And then you move into more of the associate level exams, and then kind of expert level. So for the path to SC100, you kind of had to have the fundamentals. You had to then have at least one of the associate level, whether that's, in my case, the Azure security engineer. And then I had also done SC300, which is the Identity and Identity and Access Administrator. And then finally, when you do the SC100, the combination of all three of those exams gets you the Microsoft Certified Cybersecurity Expert.
Yeah, exactly. And the way I always like to share with people is like the 1, 2, and 3 star of the levels, the 1 star
Yeah.
fundamentals. It's more like the what and why of security and of cloud. The 2 star is more like how to implement it. It's very hands-on and it's very like how to configure it. And then the 3 star, which is this level of the book that you co-authored, is more like how do we put everything together, all the pieces of an architecture.
So
I
really
like
the bigger picture, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Now, from your perspective, Graham, what is the relevance of the cybersecurity architecture in cloud, in a cloud environment today?
I think the relevance is, well, first of all, I think it's very relevant. Obviously, I wouldn't have been involved in the book, but the key thing for me is, companies have made an awful lot of investment in cloud for various reasons. Initially, people done it because they thought, it's going to save us money, and it can do. But people have quickly realized that it can save you money, it can cost you money. It's more about the agility, the velocity, the ability to let your business grow and adapt at scale. But with great power comes great responsibility, right? There's lots you can do, there's lots you can do wrong, and there's varying degrees of default configurations in all these various products. So you really need to be able to understand what they can do for you, what potential pitfalls are, but then be able to align that to the so what question. So what are you trying to achieve from a business perspective? And that when you bring that whole context together with a risk management perspective as well, you start to form that picture about, okay, I could deploy product X, but why? What am I trying to achieve? What's the business objective? Because you might find there's 3 or 4 product choices that may suit for a given solution just at the macro level. But you've kind of got to step back and say, well, what's the total cost of ownership? How can you secure it? What's the roadmap for that? So it's not just traditional architecture, because from a cybersecurity perspective, the threats are always changing, the capabilities are always changing, and the products are always changing, even if they're not security products. So actually, the cybersecurity lens is really important as a wrapper.
Exactly. And if you take a look at like in the old days or the classic days when we were on premise, you also needed cybersecurity. But now that we're moving towards the cloud, in what way has cybersecurity architecture changed moving cloud?
I think one of the key things for me, and it's some people might not think that's because of cloud. I kind of think it is, which is the whole ethos of security has changed from, I guess, if you go back even 10 years, probably people viewed your information security department as being the no police, right? They're just there to say no. And I think what really happened is that with cloud, shadow IT became a really big problem, because in the past you had to go through procurement and IT and whoever else to go and procure some IT solutions, right? Whether it's servers or an application, right? And to deploy it. But with cloud, if you've got a credit card, you can spin up a service, right? And IT might not know about it, security might not know about it. So actually that, for me, forced a mindset change from actually trying to be involved with the business early on, understand what they're trying to do, try and enable the business to deliver that business value. Because actually, if you don't know what the business is doing, you can't protect the business, right? So what you want to do is be involved as early as you can, understand the business plans, understand the security and risk ramifications of those plans potentially, and kind of get ahead of it, right? You want the business to come to you. And the other aspect of that, I would say, is from a business perspective, the sooner that they engage with an engaging cybersecurity function that wants to enable that business success, the less pain that effectively we cause them. Because if you think of developing an application and doing application releases, right? If you are 2 weeks away from releasing a product, you've already done marketing, your customers are waiting for that product, and then you go to security at the last minute to review it and they find issues. Now you've got delay and cost that you can ill afford, and potentially bad press, right? If you've said you're going to release this function, this capability. But actually, the earlier you engage security, the easier it is to adopt what secure practices are that we advise, and the less it will actually cost you. So hopefully, I think that kind of shows the the mindset shift.
Exactly. So as in the old days, in the end, when just before shipping the latest edition of the software, security said no because some things were missing. But now with cloud, we have the ability to put security already in the loop from the beginning. So the whole shift left philosophy, which is actually natively supported by cloud. So yes, I understand what you're saying, and that's a fair point. Now, what about the other point that I see in organizations? Like when I talk to, let's say, the classical networking guys, they were like, my first line of defense is the firewall, and it's all secure inside the company building. And now they're in the cloud, the data is somewhere. What is now their first line of defense, Graham, when they move to cloud?
It's identity, or I guess more specifically credentials. There is some differing mindsets. There's a kind of common phrase in the industry of identity as the new perimeter. I had I guess the honour of presenting a talk at Cloud Security Alliance UK chapter in November, and one of the things I presented was something that developed in my employer, but actually that we want to share in open source, called the Cloud Application Security Model. So look out for CSA dropping the video at some point. But the whole approach from that was that we started with a problem we wanted to solve as security engineers, and we were quite lucky where I work that for me as a cloud security engineer, I get to do a bit of engineering, a bit of design and architecture, a little bit of consultancy or guidance. So I kind of get to do all the things I enjoy. So we started with, we've got these concerns about certain gaps, right? And we've got a technology that we don't feel we use enough that could really help reduce that risk for the business. But we're probably going to change that technology stack. So one of our cloud security architects was saying, well, come up with technology agnostic use cases because the tech will change, right? And that's true, especially in cloud. We talk about that rapid rate of change. So you have to make your controls relevant to the business in such a way that the business understand them and you understand what you're underpinning for the business in terms of supporting them and protecting them, from the various risks that are out there. And we very quickly came up with a model for assessing application access, which, as we're reviewing it and testing it, realized aligns really quite nicely with CISA's zero trust maturity model, like almost by accident, which for me was quite reaffirming because it tells me possibly we're on the right track. And that whole cloud application security model for me starts from visibility. You cannot protect what you cannot see. That has its own challenges, and we can drill into that if you want. But first of all, you need to be able to see what's going on. Then you need to have good metrics around identities, data. So what identity is doing what to what application? What is the data? What are the data requirements? So how sensitive is it? What are your data residency, GDPR type requirements, regulatory? And then with the more cloud native technologies, we don't just have the kind of binary allow or block that we were used to, 5-10 years past. You've now got far more granular ability to say, well, maybe I won't block you accessing SharePoint that isn't our company's SharePoint tenant, but I can now stop you leaking data. I can now make that truly read-only in a way that I couldn't 5 or 10 years prior. So it becomes about a continuous assessment cycle, but also what are you trying to achieve? And we started off as engineers with a problem to solve and say, well, what are the bad things we're worried about? And you quickly realize that the bad things are constantly changing and you don't know what they all are at any one point in time, right? There's 0 days, there's new tactics that you're not aware of yet. But what you can define is what good looks like. What do you expect your business to be doing? And if you can enable them to do that in a way that's safe, then kind of by default, if you're not allowing something that doesn't match good, you're blocking a lot of bad. Mm-hmm. So it's trying to get that kind of virtuous circle of assessment of what does good look like for the business? What am I aware of that I'm worried about? What signals can I get that reliably tell me, can I trust this? And what can I do about it? And that allows you to be, I think, more aligned with the business goals. If you say, we want to access cloud services safely, we want to share data safely, tell me a business that doesn't have that if you extract it up high enough. Hopefully that kind of makes sense.
That makes sense, definitely. And Then what I think that many organizations are struggling with, especially IT managers, is they want to move to cloud, and perhaps they are already in cloud with one leg, but another leg is still on premise. So
Yeah.
basically they are in a hybrid world, a hybrid cloud, and that brings extra complexities or challenges with cybersecurity. So from your perspective, what are some extra challenges, complexities that these IT managers face in a hybrid world?
There are a number of things. A lot of the reasons why you have. So I guess if we flip back slightly to the start of the journey, you've got companies who joined cloud um, or got involved in cloud when they still had quite a sizable on-premise estate. And you've got legacy applications. Some of those can be refactored quite easily into modern application stacks, some not so much. You may have lost technical expertise in those applications over years. People move, you don't quite realize the knowledge gaps you've got until, it's really important, like you're trying to do a cloud migration. And does anyone know how this application works? No, it kind of just works in the corner, right? Okay, but it's really important. And then you've got businesses that are cloud native, they've never had on-prem to contend with. And these businesses that had your legacy, your hybrid, they're still going to contend with companies that don't have any of that technical debt. Um, the way that I see how you do that is a couple of things. One is anything that you can do to apply cloud native management to on-premise resources is good. And from a Microsoft perspective, that's obviously things like Azure Arc in terms of being able to reach in to your on-premises and also other cloud providers if you're multi-cloud. Um, that's one aspect of it, and that helps with visibility, like I said before, because if you can see your on-prem infrastructure and your cloud native, and I'm not going to say single pane of glass because these days there's lots of portals, there's lots of glasses of pane, shall we say, but an ability to manage them in a consistent way really, really helps, right? Because you've got one place to look to see your estate and see the health of it. When you start to plug that into, and again, I'll stick to Microsoft because it was a Microsoft book that we did. I obviously work multi-cloud in my current employer, but the same kind of concepts apply. So if you've got cloud native tooling from that cloud service provider that can help you not just for your cloud native resources, but for your on-prem resources, have a consistent way to say, what is the posture of that device? Can I protect that device? What's running on it? So if you look at Defender XDR from an endpoint perspective, Defender for Cloud as well, you start to be able to have that kind of full stack visibility that it doesn't matter if it's an on-prem physical server, an on-prem virtual machine, storage array, or something more cloud native. You've got one place where you can see all of those, you can see their posture, you can see what's happening, you can ingest all those logs into your SIEM and your SOAR. So for me, it goes back to what I said before, visibility is key. You can't secure what you can't see. That gives you another problem though. Now you've got lots of data, how do you make sense of it?
Exactly, exactly. We'll tackle the data topic in a moment. I just wanted to highlight a key point you made is that in a hybrid environment, use the cloud native tools as best as you can because they are out of the box and they work seamlessly with what you have. And for those in the audience who are not so familiar with Azure Arc, Azure Arc is basically a way that you can bring your on-premise environment visible in your Azure portal. And then you have some nice extra features like you can use the same monitoring and the same security set, almost the same, from the cloud down to your on-premise, which gives you a single pane of glass as good as it's possible. So that's a great point, Graham. But then let's continue with your second point, the data. Lots of data in the cloud. How do we make sense of it all?
Yeah, exactly. And there's two aspects to that. There's data in terms of your business data, but I think just following on from the previous point, you can end up between something like Azure Arc and all your logs coming from your cloud native stuff, your logs coming in from on-prem, whether they are hooked up with Azure Arc or whether you've got some kind of log collector sending things into Sentinel or whatever your SIEM is, you've now got lots and lots and lots of information about your infrastructure. But now you need to work out what you're going to do with it. It's great having all that visibility, but now you need to do something with it to make that investment worthwhile, right? And that's where actually, if you can have something that brings in your metrics and your visibility from on-prem and cloud native into one place, you can start to leverage that. So when you start to look at some of the Microsoft technologies in that space around Defender XDR, Defender for Cloud, Sentinel, and so on, and probably things like, I'll leave it at that at the moment, but you start to get to where you can start to apply certain benchmarks, security benchmarks, to the signals from those devices. And signals could be logs. It could also be you've got an agent natively on a cloud device. You've got an agent on an ARC-enabled device. So it's not just giving you logs. It's able to actually see the configuration and the applications. So with that kind of on-prem, that full hybrid view, management view, you can then take something like the Defender Stack and say, okay, well, my business operates in a regulatory environment where HIPAA is really important, or SOC 2, or whatever the regulatory framework might be. I may also care about CIS compliance, for example. So you can actually then start to say, well, these are the frameworks I want you to consider in Defender when you are assessing all these different devices that you can see you've got agents on or logs from. So then you can tell me across that whole estate, whether it's on-premise or whether it's cloud native, what is the posture of my estate? And those frameworks, depending on which one you choose, you can pick and choose what you enable, basically. You can have multiple. You can start to say, well, I can now see from a network security perspective, from a data security perspective, from an encryption perspective. A lot of these benchmarks are broken down into different domains. So it's not just, hey, look, what percentage compliant am I with HIPAA or whatever. It's actually, you can drill down to specific areas and go, well, actually, in the round, we're pretty good, but actually, network security, that needs a bit of effort, a bit of focus. What that then allows you to do, along with an understanding of your business risk appetite, is to decide, okay, what am I going to go after next? Because these things will tell you about vulnerabilities as well. So they'll tell you about software packages that are vulnerable, right? But if you've worked in this industry for a while, you start to get to the point where, again, you get a lot of data. You can almost be like alert blindness, right? Alert fatigue. So if I've got 2,000 critical CVEs in my infrastructure, where do I even begin, right? What do I fix first? So a lot of what I'm seeing, not just in the Microsoft technology, but a lot of what I'm seeing in the industry is the vendors trying to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you to help you prioritize what's worth, what's got the most bang for buck. If I fix this one vulnerability, it will fix, 10% of my estate. Whereas this one here is maybe involving 2 servers, but they're on really critical application servers. So they're really trying to give you as much, without having your business logic, but they're trying to give you as much help as they can to say, there's lots of bad stuff, but actually, if you focus on this, you'll make the biggest impact on your posture. Now, obviously, once you do that, something else is now top of the tree, but it does start to help you focus your effort.
Exactly. That's what I love about the cloud ecosystem, and especially on the Microsoft Azure side, is that the more visibility you get in cloud, even the on-premise resources and assets, Azure helps you make the priorities. Like, these things, tackle them first from a security perspective, just like you mentioned. So that's really powerful. Now, I'm based in Belgium. You're based in Scotland.
Yeah.
Here in Belgium, what I'm seeing, because there was a little bit of a delay in the adoption towards cloud, what I'm now seeing is organizations are in cloud, they have their applications running, and now comes the point that IT managers are getting aware, wait a minute, it's running and it's operating in cloud, but is it safe and secure? So
Yeah.
their first concern was, is it working? Yes, it's working. But now, second concern, is it safe? What can you give as advice to these IT managers? Like, how do you assess the security? What do they need to look for?
I think fundamental is, and I hate sounding like a broken record, but fundamental visibility, right? Once you've got that visibility, and we've talked about how you can achieve that, it's then working out, so what? And the so what has to kind of come from you to begin with. You can turn on some frameworks for the regulatory frameworks that matter for you legally in the jurisdiction that you're in. And they're going to tell you lots of stuff that's bad, with various levels of bad, right? But like I said before, you can't suddenly go and remediate everything. So there's almost you have to look internally to say, what do I care about from a business perspective? What does a bad day look like for me? So, is it ransomware? Is it you mistakenly have an open storage bucket that's got customer data? There's a million and one things you could worry about, but actually, what does your risk appetite look like? What's your tolerance to risk? And then you can apply your own rating to what Azure and Defender will tell you, right? Because that's a view that's not based on your business. That's almost like an industry view. NIST says this is bad. Okay, HIPAA says this is bad, and sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't, because they've got different functions. HIPAA 1 is focused on healthcare. So you need to be able to reflect internally on what is our risk appetite. Okay, do we initially want to say anything that is critical or high? We will alert to our SOCOM, we will investigate, we will prioritize for remediation based on what the tooling is telling us. That's probably a common first step, and it's not a bad first step. What you'll then get to is where you get to the edge cases, right? Nothing's ever simple, right? So it might be that the remediation advice from the Microsoft tooling is to do X, right? And you say, right, okay, well, I can't upgrade that server for that critical line of business application beyond Windows Server 2016 because the application is out of support, we can't upgrade it, and so on and so forth, right? So the automatic remediation of upgrade everything, keep it current, you already can't do, right? So then it starts to say, well, okay, well, what would give me the most meaningful reduction in my risk? The risk isn't going to go away, but what will give me the most meaningful reduction in that risk? And that might be, what other monitoring can I put on? What other things can I put in the way of that critical infrastructure? Which means it may not actually be less risky, but it's harder to get to, right? We talk in the book about defense in depth, and defense in depth can be a bit of a buzzword. That there are people, I think, who throw it around without really understanding what it means, right? You want as many layers of defense in depth as your budget and your risk appetite says is sensible for your business, right? So if you consider the old on-premise world, right? So your firewall is your perimeter, and nobody's ever going to get past that firewall. We all know that's not true. In the cloud world, your firewalls are more open anyway, right? Because everything talks to everything. So that doesn't mean to say you don't need network layer controls. You still do, but they're now only one layer. What about identity? Are you managing the lifecycle of your identities? Do you know that your identities are having their passwords rotated if it's a user account, if it's a service account? Is it managed in any way? If it's a cloud service principal, again, are you rotating those secrets? And then you think, well, if it's a customer-facing resource with a web application, I might want a web application firewall in front of it. I might want Azure DDoS protection. So all of a sudden, I've got several network controls. I've got some application layer security controls. Maybe paying more attention to who's got access to that system, who grants access to that. Does somebody lose access if they change job role or leave the company? And these are all problems we had pre-cloud, right? But with cloud, we've just amplified those problems because we've got far more things to manage. We've got far more identities. People are accessing things from far more locations and devices. So they're not new problems, but the scale of the problems got bigger. But fundamentally, it's the same mindset, which is, what am I worried about? What can I do to mitigate? And if I can't mitigate, what can I do to put layers in front of that so that actually either your chance of getting to that resource is lessened, or the damage you can do is lessened if you get there, if that makes sense.
Yes, makes sense. Hi there, I'm Jetro Wils, your host, and I love bringing you fresh insights on cybersecurity, cloud technology, governance, and auditing. Cyber threats are evolving fast. Protecting your business, ensuring compliance, and maintaining trust with your stakeholders isn't just important, it is essential. Ignoring cybersecurity, that's a risk you don't want to take. No matter your industry or company size, protecting sensitive data and ensuring operational resilience should be a priority. Regulations like NIS2 and DORA are already shaping the way businesses handle security, making compliance non-negotiable. At SecWise, we help businesses like yours stay secure and compliant. Here's what we offer: security roadmaps, practical steps tailored to your operations, Azure, M365, or even your hybrid workplace. Compliance readiness, Meet ISO 27001, NIS2 and DORA requirements with confidence. SOC implementation, real-time threat detection and response 24/7. Cloud and AI security, advanced protection against evolving threats, and end-to-end support, from risk analysis to remediation and continuous access to our specialists. Since you're listening to the Blue Dragon podcast, as a thank you, you will get 3% off your next purchase within the SecWise portfolio. Whether it's a full NIS2 assessment or managed security services, 3% off your next purchase can save you hundreds of euros. Visit secwise.eu/Blue Dragon podcast to get started. Make cybersecurity your strength. Get started today. Visit secwise.eu/Blue Dragon podcast. That's actually a great point about the defense in depth that I often share with my clients, that they understand to stack their defenses in such a way that on each level or layer there is at least a control that blocks or tries to mitigate the risk. Clear. Now, and by the way, about the identities and the privileges, that's a great point. A few months ago, I was at a client and I was doing an Azure security assessment, and they actually had never thought about their identity lifecycle. So when a team member moved from R&D, which was a highly privileged environment, to another team outside of it, he just kept his credentials and his privileges. So you had these veterans.
Permission creep.
You have these veterans running around in your company for 30 years and they have like access to everything, while they only need 10% of what they actually have today. And so they never thought about that. So that's a great point. That is part of cybersecurity, folks. The identity management in cloud is very important. Also, to limit the privilege, so at least privileged principles there. Great.
I think as well, as well as least privilege, another thing that people tend to forget, least privilege is great, right? And if you can't reduce the privileges, can you make just-in-time access, so the standing privilege is less? And the other one, which we all forget about, segregation of duties. Right? Do I need that access for this job role? No, but it's handy. No, but do you need that for that job role?
Exactly. Nice, great. Now, in your book, there's a whole chapter on security operations and the strategy behind it. Can you explain the role of a SIEM and SOAR in a modern security architecture today? Like, what is it and why is it important?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with SIEM, and SIEM is kind of a logical extension to the point about visibility. So SIEM is basically where you ingest all your logs from all the platforms that you're monitoring. Now, that's a very simple way of putting it. One thing you'll very quickly find out, though, is that if you decide to log every possible event from every possible system you've got, you're probably going to run out of money, right? So people will start with, we need to monitor everything. But what you very quickly get to is, if you're not going to take action based on something that event would tell you, then why are you ingesting it, right? Or why are you ingesting it in the log source for your SIEM, right? Because that might be expensive. You may need it or audit or other use cases. But if you're not going to take action on it because it's a bad thing, why ingest it to your SIEM? Because all you're doing is putting your data storage and data processing costs for your SIEM up with no real benefit, right? But it's very easy to start with, log all the things. Yeah, okay. So now we can see everything, but we're not doing anything about it. Oh, you've got a bigger bill, right? So it's very easy to have that kind of gold rush mindset. So SIEM is, you want to know what are the actionable things that you need to monitor, because they may lead you to have a security incident if you missed those, right? So it might be logs from your identity provider, whether that's Azure Entra. I thought I was done calling it AAD, but now and again it still comes back in. But whether that's your Entra, or whether that's your on-premise Active Directory or another IDP, maybe Okta or whatever, you need to be getting logs from your IDP, because it's not just about what is my server doing, what is my application doing, it's what are my identities doing. And I deliberately didn't say users, because human and non-human identities is a really important point to make, and we can touch on it later if we've got time, but non-humans going to become a real big problem soon with agentic AI. So all the things we're already not good at as an industry, we need to get better at really quickly, I would suggest. But yeah, so you pick, you might want sys logs from your Linux machines, you might want Windows event logs of security and certain other categories, certain application logs, things that give you good actionable intel that says, if I look at that event from here, and I look at what's coming from my identity plane, and then I look at this, if I was a SOC analyst, I can look at that and go, that's potential malicious behavior, right? Where you then get into your SOAR is, traditionally, people have had SIEMs for years, long before cloud, right? But again, SOC analysts had to do a lot of work to build automation, to build detections that says, if you see this in combination with this and this, that equals bad, or potentially bad, it needs someone to go look at that, right, to decide, should I be worried and what should I do? Where SOAR comes in is SOAR is your orchestration and automation for your security response. So automation is pretty much key, but with cloud in general, there is so much change. There is so much new resources being spun up all the time that you need to automate just to not fall behind too much. People used to see automation as, well, you'll automate my job away. I would suggest these days you need to automate to keep up. There's just so much to be focusing on even just in security, right? But even wider IT, the more you automate, the more you can keep up with the constant pace of change of cloud. So
Exactly.
with SOAR, you can start to have automated detections where maybe by the time a human sees a ticket, there's been lots of automation workflows already run to gather context so that once an analyst sees it, they've got a lot easier and faster job to decide, is this good or bad? There may even be some automated responses. So for example, you see some malware on a device and you might have it automatically trigger your endpoint defenses to isolate that device, to lock it down without even an analyst seeing it, right? Now, if you get those rules wrong, yeah, you can sometimes have false positives, but if you're isolating a device, that can be reversed, right? You're not doing any real damage. You're not deleting an identity and having to deal with downstream consequences. If you isolate someone's laptop so that it can't get anywhere, and then you realize, actually, I think we got that wrong, you just remove the isolation, right? So that's where SOAR comes in, is that trying as much as possible to predefine automatic analysis and automatic response and orchestrate all of that. Because again, otherwise you're going to need a massive SOC team, right?
Mm-hmm.
The amount of signals, the amount of devices, the amount of applications, automation is how you keep up ultimately.
Exactly. I fully agree there. And then my main client is a managed security service provider. We have a 24/7 SOC for our customers. And one thing that I can share with the audience is, if you're looking for a managed security service provider, don't just ask like which tools are you using to 24/7 monitor everything, but ask how much automations have you built on top of what's existing out of the box. Because
Exactly.
that is the intellectual property, let's say, of your SOC provider, is the level of automations. Because the more you automate, the faster the response, the easier for the analyst to respond afterwards or to evaluate the actions. So great point there, Graham. By the way, in Scotland, how is the climate regarding IT managers and security concerns? Are they aware that they need a SOC, or is it still like we can do everything ourselves in house?
Um, I can only talk from experience in financial services. I think financial services have got a good handle on that. And how much of that comes from regulation? You can argue that we do because we have to. Financial services is heavily regulated, which is a good thing. And so probably we've been doing that kind of thinking for a lot longer. If you're a smaller or medium enterprise, you might not be there yet. Your budgets are lesser, and you probably don't have the same level of regulation. But I think it doesn't really matter if you're in the UK, Europe, US. If you're a large enterprise, you're heavily regulated. You're having to deal with that. I think it's as you come down the kind of size of organization is where that level of maturity probably isn't the same. But like everything else, if you generalize, there'll be some small providers that are doing an amazing job that some large companies probably could learn from, right?
Definitely, definitely. And actually, talking about legislation and regulations, here in Europe, I mean, Europe is number one in the world regarding regulations, and we have GDPR, and now we have NIS2, the Network and Information Security Directive 2. I think Scotland is also part of that
Yeah, we are.
scope, basically. So, what can you recommend IT managers, CIOs, CISOs? They're in the cloud. How can they become compliant to all these rules? Because they no longer control the hardware.
It's going to be it's a little bit of risk management. So again, do you have a good risk culture? Do you have a risk appetite that's based on something other than sticking your finger in there, right? You've thought about what level of impact you can tolerate from a given risk event. You know, how high an impact and how likely of that impact occurring can you tolerate? What would the business impact be? And that comes from a couple of things. One is I'll make it fined, right, from a regulatory perspective, but there's also, I guess, your reputation, your brand reputation can take a hit. So, and if you're in business and your brand reputation takes a critical hit, well, you might not be in business anymore, right? It has happened. So I think it starts from there. And then I think understanding what are the key regulatory frameworks, even if you're not in a regulated industry, what are the key regulatory frameworks in your legal jurisdiction, whether that's UK, Belgium, United States, and try to leverage in your tooling, and it can be traditional on-prem security tooling. It can be, we've had things like Nessus vulnerability scanners for years, Nessus, Qualys, all these vendors, and we've got all the cloud native stuff. We've talked about Defender and so on. Leverage where they already have support for, we understand what the framework says, and we know how to measure your applications and your infrastructure against that framework. And then again, you'll get to a point where lots of bad stuff to fix, okay, but which of the bad stuff do we really care about? And that's where your risk posture, your risk culture comes in. You need to be able to articulate that clearly in a business sense. I remember years ago being a security engineer on a project, and in classic engineer sense, I want the project to do the proper secure thing, right? But then there's challenges on timescales, on budget, all the usual business challenges, right? Oh, we can't do the secure thing. We want to risk accept. Yeah. Nobody is going to be immune to that conversation. And I remember having a conversation with my then manager, and he said, "Yeah, yes, your job is to advise them to how to do this securely, but ultimately the business may make a risk decision that you as an engineer don't agree with. But as long as you clearly articulate what is the risk, what is the impact if it occurs, how likely is it to occur, if the owner of the risk in the business says, I still want to accept that risk, you've done your job. Because although you're not, if you like, at the utopian security position, the business understands the risk that it has, right? The other flip side to that is that if that risk materializes like you said it was, if somebody says, oh, well, why did you say we should do that? That was a bad idea. Well, I think you'll find this said this was probably not advisable. But you've got to think in terms of business, like if you as a business see an opportunity to get in early on an emerging market before other people even get there, and let's say you think by being first to market you can make £50 million a year in profit, right? And if you fall foul of this one vulnerability, if the total cost of your business of reputational damage, regulatory fines, whatever, is £500,000, you as a business might think that's worth accepting. I'm not going to tell you you should, but as a security professional, you need to be able to clearly articulate risk, impact, and likelihood really clearly, so that anyone accepting a risk actually understands what they're accepting as a risk in that business.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that makes sense. Now, I can imagine that many IT managers are having a constrained budget, and they're now in the cloud, and they're thinking, okay, after listening to this podcast, like, okay, we need to invest more in security. Let's say there's a bag of money. It's limited, but it's a bag of money. Percentage-wise, how would you divide the money for an average organization? Let me give you some examples. We talked about securing identities. So we talked about privileged identity management, so the PIM and the limited, access to those elevated roles. We talked about visibility, so with the SIEM and getting all those logs and then acting on them. We talked about Defender, which monitors your security posture. All these things cost money. There is like you mentioned, the policies. I want to be HIPAA compliant or NIS2 compliant. How as an IT manager should I spend percentage-wise my budget for an average organization? What would you give as an advice?
I'm probably going to say something that's not popular, and this is my view, but I personally don't believe that we prioritize identity enough. So I guess you probably want, it depends if you're talking about how much of your security budget or how much of your IT budget, because they're two very different questions. If I talk
let's go
about,
security budget first.
yeah, so if I talk about security budget, I think I probably want to spend 20 to 30% on logging monitoring, right? It's fairly foundational. So I think, nearly a third of the spend potentially is probably appropriate. I think you probably want maybe another 15% on endpoint protection. Ideally, you want something that quite seamlessly integrates with everything else I've said before, everything else I'm about to say. You're going to have a much nicer time if they integrate well. That's not to say you have to use the same supplier, just that they have to integrate well. And what you'll tend to find with cloud providers is initially the better capability is for their cloud, right? And then over time, the kind of multi-cloud and multi-vendor integrations come, right? But release number one is going to be really good at that vendor stack, right? Because that's what they're going to build against. If you're one cloud provider, it's easier. If you're multi-cloud, you've got a decision to make around cloud native versus generic, because there's pros and cons for both. I think beyond that, I'd probably say 25% on identity, personally. And then I think most of the rest on probably, and I'm going to keep risk out of it because in a lot of companies, risk is a different pot to security. But I think spend the rest on data. So understanding your data, protecting your data. And again, you can't secure what you can't see. So first of all, do you know where all your data is and what it is? Second of all, can you then classify it? Can you use tools like Purview to go, well, that looks like it's got credit card numbers in it. That looks like it's got personal identifiable information in it, and so on. And then can you leverage that in your actual security controls so that I can take action that's quite severe, where you've got a potential breach of really sensitive data, and I might take different action on something that's fairly mundane data that actually, if that was leaked, it's not really going to have any impact. The identity one for me is where I think we underspend. And we underspend in terms of time more than we underspend in terms of money. So there are lots of companies that have identity governance and administration platforms. I mean, to a certain extent, access reviews and permissions management within the kind of M365 and Entra world is kind of Microsoft's take on that. They've taken things like Microsoft Identity Manager of old, taken a lot of that stuff and made it more cloud native. So you've got things that look at permission creep, that look at identity lifecycle management. But lots of companies have this stuff, right? They've got the tools. They don't actually invest the time in actually understanding what should I care about and what actually are my risks from an identity perspective. One of the things I'm really focused on looking forward is we're going to have an explosion in non-human identities. So, and to kind of make that less technical, so we've always had the idea of the user, right? You and I logging onto our laptop or company application, but you've always had non-human identities. They used to just call them service accounts, right? And then service principals, managed identities, which is just a service principal. But increasingly, people aren't paying attention to the non-human identities, right? So you might have good lifecycle management on your access, my access, right? But is anyone paying attention to the non-human identities, the service principals, the app registrations? I can almost guarantee they're not, right?
Exactly, and there's no MFA for them.
There's no MFA for them. Are they over-permissioned? Almost certainly yes. What consent grants do they have? More than they need, and so on and so forth, right? What doesn't help as a security person who's quite passionate about identity is I can't apply in the Microsoft world conditional access policies to application registrations without buying. So if I've got E5 or I've bought Entra P2, right? So I've got identity protection. I can apply conditional access. I still can't apply conditional access to service principals. I have to buy workload identity premium, which is per identity per month, right? So have a think about how many non-human identities you have in Entra today, right? And then you look at AI, right? it wouldn't be a blog, a podcast, on anything without mentioning AI these days, right? And I'm not pro AI or anti AI. I'm somewhere in the middle. I see benefits for it. I also see challenges and things to secure, right? I see things we can do wrong. But one of the big focuses, I think, looking ahead this year is there's going to be, and if you look at Ignite, Microsoft Ignite, they even made it very clear they're going very much towards agentic AI. So what's agentic AI? So up till now, you've had, I want to go in and I want to go and ask this large language model to create me an image or analyze a document or write me, a job description or something, right? And that's very much I ask, you give, I ask, you give, but you can only do what I say you can do within a certain confines.
Very use case specific.
Very use case specific, yeah. With agentic AI, you're letting the machine have a lot more power. The AI can go on and take actions on your behalf. So the AI can go and say, I'm going to go and spin up a server. I'm going to create an application. I'm going to do X, Y, Z. An AI becomes a user, right? An AI can request access to something, potentially without a human ever being involved. Now, I'm not saying any of that's bad, but if we're not managing non-human identities well today, we're going to have an explosion of those identities within the next 12 months, right? So that's where I think identity, we don't spend enough time on it.
Yeah.
And I think I read a Google Mandiant report last year. 47% of cloud compromise that Mandiant investigated came from stolen credentials or misconfigured credentials.
Yeah. Which makes sense because that's how you also in your security budget, you also put a lot of effort there on the identities. Yes, makes sense. Now we're coming to the end of the episode, Graham, and I wanted to ask you two more questions. Many organizations I talk to are always surprised when they understand the shared responsibility model. Typically, they think we're in the cloud, our data is in the cloud, so Microsoft takes care of everything. And then the shared responsibility model says, well, you're actually, dear customer, responsible for your data, identities, and endpoints yourself, right?
Yeah.
What advice would you give to those IT managers who realize, like, oh, I'm responsible for my data in the cloud?
I think the fundamental, I mean, if you're studying for the exam, you'll spend time looking at the differences between on-premise, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, and so on. But kind of if you forget about all those different layers and people talk about the pizza box diagrams and all that kind of thing, it comes down to a couple of things. You're always responsible for your data, right? You're always responsible for your identities. That's a given, right? Mm-hmm. Everything else will change depending on, is it software as a service, where pretty much you're responsible for the data. In the SaaS application, you're responsible for access to it, right? So again, data and access or identity. If you come down the stack to IaaS, yes, you're responsible for the operating system, the applications, the databases, and the data and the access. So kind of forget the variance and say data and access and identity is always your responsibility. That's to me, the real simple way to view it.
Exactly, and that also gives the implication for people in the audience. That means that you have to back up your data, even if it's in the cloud. You have to not only back up your data, but also encrypt and secure the backups of your data.
And not only that, test you can restore from those backups.
Exactly. So when I give a training on the fundamentals, I always ask, like, who's using a Microsoft OneDrive, and then half the class goes up or even more, and then I say, who backs up their OneDrive, and you see all the hands goes down. And like, what, we have to back up OneDrive? What do you mean? Doesn't Microsoft do it? No, you have to back up your G Drive, your OneDrive, everything, because you're responsible for your data. So that's something you mentioned as well in the book, so that's a great point. Final question. Imagine there are some people who are listening and saying, I want to take the SC100, the Microsoft Cybersecurity Architect Exam. Apart from reading the book and doing the mock questions, what other advice can you give these candidates?
I think, for me, really lean into Microsoft Learn. Microsoft have done a fantastic job with Learn, and anyone who knows me knows I don't throw praise at them easily. I'm a security engineer, so I'm going to be quick to moan if something's not quite right. But you've got curated learning paths, of which SC100 is just one of them. Depending upon what you're going for, you've got sandboxes where you can try stuff. Less so for SC100 because it's a bit more theoretical than, say, security engineer, but it's a really good resource. If your organization has I think it's a unified support agreement with Microsoft, make use of the Enterprise Skills Initiative, or ESI. You'll be able to know if you go to esi.microsoft.com and try and sign in with your corporate ID. If you can't, you don't have it. If you can, you do. What that gives you is free practice exams, and it will also give you discounted exams as well. And that's not really about studying, but it's good to know that actually, it used to be completely free. It used to be a voucher that was a free exam pass. It's now, I think, 50% off, which really comes from people booking them and not turning up. So they kind of had to do something about that. But that also is a good way to prepare, because if you're going in for something and you think, I think I'm kind of ready, but maybe some practice exams, I think I'm great. Some practice exams, I'm a little bit lower. If the exam's going to cost you half the price, well, you get 2 shots for the price of 1. And if that helps you get the nerves under, because I think sometimes you can talk yourself into, I'm going to fail. Yep, okay, but what if you don't? So I think that's quite good. It's not just the knowledge, it's also the knowledge that, well, I can have 2 shots at this without being too worried about, I've got 160 euros or whatever it is. Well, maybe it's half that. Exactly. If that helps take the pressure off, that's a good thing.
Exactly. And to be honest, I failed my 2-star exam, the Azure Security Engineer. I found that the most tough exam for me.
I was the same. I was second type. It's a hard one.
I was like, what? You have to really, where do you press which button, which thing to do? I was like, oh my gosh, this whole procedure you have to know by heart. But then the SC100 is more about insights. How do you combine things? What's the focus? So scenario-based, really, it helped me to gain insights, right?
I think that's the thing, like the security engineer one, you might not be working with every element of the stack in your day job, every day, and that's what will trip you up. But like you say, SC100, there's a lot more concepts, not theory, but it's less pushing the buttons. It's more what buttons should you push and why. Exactly.
So Graham, last question. Looking forward in the future, what is your future looking like? Another book, or what are you working on?
Well, I hadn't really planned for the book, but I guess having done one, my mind is now, would I do another one? Yes, I would. What do I want to do? Is it more of the same or something different? I've got some ideas, but I've not got like a firm book outline. But if you consider that a year ago, author wasn't on my list of things I wanted to do, so there's that. And I've been doing a bit more in the kind of security research side. So rather than consuming, threat intelligence and vulnerability information and working out what do I do about that, I've actually been quite enjoying poking under the covers of certain services, and you might see more on that. I've done a little bit of that. I've blogged a few things I've found that weren't what I thought they should be. But I guess the engineer in me is, I like working out how things work, and sometimes you understand best how they work when they don't work. Certainly 27 years in IT has told me you don't understand how it works until it doesn't.
Nice. So Graham, if people want to reach out to you and have some questions or anything, what's the best way to approach you?
Primary way for me would be LinkedIn. I've quite a heavy presence on LinkedIn, and then I do have my blog, siriustech.co.uk, and my email is very prominent on the front page of that. So really, I would say that's the primary ways. Wonderful. And by all means, do reach out. I like to learn. I like to share knowledge as much as I like to gain it. So.
Wonderful. We'll put all the links in the description of this episode as well. Graham, thank you so much for joining in this episode. I wish you a wonderful time and hope to see you again in the future.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Pietro. Have a nice night.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Blue Dragon Podcast with Graham Gold. I'd like to invite you to join the BlueDragonPodcast.com website. You can sign up for this newsletter, and then you'll get the executive summary of each episode. So in one PDF, you get the key concepts and the lessons learned from each episode. Have a wonderful time and see you next time.